possibly almost all of you are working online at the moment, and it's exhausting, being online all day. So I'm really, really grateful that you've turned up for this session and that we can, have this joint effort on how we go about assessing young learners online, which I appreciate. The reason we're running the session is we appreciate it must be a concern for many of you, because it's very, very different if you can't actually connect in the way that you do in the classroom, and that you can't critically oversee assessment as you do in the classroom. So let's just look at what I'm going to run through today. First of all, we're going to look at how assessing young learners online is different, and it is different. I'm not going to argue that it's the same. So we're going to look at how that's different. And we're going to look at what kind of assessment methods we can use when we're working online, and what the outcome of those methods might be. And then we're going to go on to look at some examples of what kind of activities we can use. And I should say here that I know many of you, although many of you will be teaching online at the moment, some of you will also be sort of trying to manage that offline, or you might not have much contact with your students. So it's impossible to cover sort of everything in 1 hour, but I'm hoping that the ideas I can give you enough sort of strategies that you can adapt it for your own situation. So as we go through, it would be good if you could all think about your individual situation and how you might be able to apply things. And then after we've looked at some examples, we're going to look at what I think is a very important element, which is how we record and report progress, which is, after all, what assessment is all about, or arguably the purpose of assessment. So before we make a start, now there's over 700 of you, so this is going to be interesting, but I'd just like to get a quick idea. There's a question I want to ask you, and you can just type some very short, quick notes in the chat box. And I'll just summarize some of those. What I want to ask you, first of all, before we start, is many of you have been working online now for a few weeks. What kind of assessment activities do you do now that you're having to teach online? Or have you stopped assessing altogether? Have you decided it's not possible? So I can see lots of ideas coming up here, lots of quizzes, Google Forms, online tests. Wow, masses of ideas. I hope you'll be able to read each other's there. Some of you have said projects, speaking, meeting in Zoom, grammar worksheets, lots of you using Google and Microsoft Team forms. And some of you talking about what you're assessing, vocabulary and grammar. So everybody still seems to be trying to assess, which is great. Nobody's saying they've stopped assessing or they're not trying to assess. So you've all got lots and lots of examples of things you're doing. That's absolutely great. So I hope we can bring these together. So let's make a start and have a look. Let's start with the first part of this here. So thank you for your comments and your responses there. But I'm now going to start. Now I've seen your great ideas, and some of you have made the point about reliability. I'm going to move on to what we're going to look at today, and I hope this can help you. So now the first thing I want us to think about before we go into ideas and examples is, how is assessing young learners online different? Obviously, we do need to keep assessing them for our own purposes, but also because the children and the parents and the schools expect some sort of report on progress. So we have to do something about it. We have to know how effective our teaching is. And the first thing I want us to think about, therefore, is the learner's situation. Now, I know lots of you, you'll know this, you'll have thought of this, but I thought it's just helpful to summarize it for everybody. So let's think about our young learner's situation now that we're teaching online. Many of them, if you are, and obviously, as I said, it will vary how much access you have to them. But of course, many of them being young learners, they'll actually be very comfortable working online. So I don't think that's the issue. But I think what is the issue is the context they're doing this in. You think they're quite young, they probably don't really fully understand the situation, of what's happened in the wider world. They're at home, they're not with their peers, they're possibly being overlooked by their parents or checked by their parents while they're working with you. And they may be just feeling very uncomfortable with the teaching setup because it's not familiar for them. So I think, obviously, when we look at assessment, I've said before on these things, we've got to make sure that before we assess anybody, they feel very comfortable with the situation they're being assessed in. And so we've already got a challenge here because we're trying to assess the students in a situation that they don't feel super comfortable in, perhaps, and where they've got, people checking on them or overhearing them. And the other thing we've got to think about, which obviously you've all thought about, I can see from your comments, is what's actually possible online. Is it okay to do the same old tests that we always did? What sort of outcomes can we expect? Should we be doing multiple choice and paper type tests that we did before? And arguably, probably not. We've got to do something different online, because once people are online, we've got to engage them. We can't really have lots of silent time. So we've got to start thinking about what's possible in a slightly different way, what's reasonable and what's possible. And then the most important thing, and especially for everybody in assessment, but especially for young learners, is thinking about what's fair and what's reliable. What reliable judgments can we make, and what's fair for the students? And I think we have to bear this in mind above all else, as we're thinking about the type of tasks and how we manage the tasks and how we're going to do reporting. And I think what most of us would conclude in this situation is, aside from some, logging into some secure site, that the sort of end of term summative testing that we've done in the past is not really possible at the moment, in that it's probably not fair and not reliable. And so what we really need to focus on is our formative testing, our assessment for learning. How are we going to monitor progress in the classroom, and focus on what's happening formatively? So that's really, the background to what we're going to do today. So I've said we've got to manage assessment differently. So what does that mean? Well, I'd like to ask you to think about assessment in not necessarily a different way, but perhaps to think of a particular dimension of assessment. So normally when we say assessment, we think it's interchangeable with testing. And I think once we start focusing on the word testing, we start to get worried about, are we doing a proper test? Is it a real test? What's the test like? But if we think about assessment in the wider sense, and especially in the classroom, what assessment is really is it's a bit like a research project. It's about collecting evidence. You are gathering evidence on how well the students can do something, or how well they can perform, or whether they've absorbed something you've taught them. So I would like you, perhaps, instead of thinking about assessment, to think to yourself, right, what I'm doing is I'm collecting evidence. So if I'm collecting evidence, what are the different ways I can do that? Because I think it opens up your thinking, and it opens up the possibilities of what you think you can do. If you think this isn't a test, this is collecting evidence. And then the other thing we want to do, I think, in our current situation online is make sure that we're assessing performance or usage rather than scores. Scoring is always going to be unreliable because of the online situation with our learners. And, I'll come into that in a minute. But I mean, again, I think it's almost like a qualitative study. We're collecting evidence and we're looking at the quality of that evidence rather than just thinking what's wrong and what's right, so it's not about scoring. Now, I mean, the key thing I would say here, which I'm sure is a conclusion many of you have reached yourselves, is let's not worry about cheating. And I know one of the concerns, and this is what I mean about collecting evidence, if you think of assessment, you start thinking, oh, but are the students cheating? If I give them a test online, I can't see what they're doing. I can't see if they're looking things on their phone, on a dictionary, on Google. If I ask them to go away and do something, maybe they're cheating. And maybe they are. Maybe they are, but what I'm saying is we can't control that. So let's not worry about it. Let's think actually about how we can utilize that. So as I say, let's focus on we're collecting evidence. We're not going to worry about cheating because that would give us the wrong focus. Now, the other thing which is true for assessment generally, and if you've joined me before, you know that I've said this before, is one of the most important things, and I think especially in this online situation, is that students understand how you're assessing them and what to expect. So we're not going to try and assess them without them realizing what's going on. We're going to tell them what's going on and tell them what kind of performance we expect from them. And in that way, they can perform better. And this is a really, really important point, because remember I said in the last slide, we're looking at the students are in quite an uncomfortable situation, perhaps with people watching them. They're young learners, and so it's very, very important that they can achieve something, that we can report their achievement. Now, it might not be 100% achievement, it might not be as wonderful as we want it, but we've got to look when what are we collecting evidence of good things, of things that they can achieve that we can report back on. Which brings me on to my final point about managing assessment differently. So you said, I see, when it's not a good idea to sort of register things as a series of scores. What we want to assess, what we want to collect evidence on, is a range of progress points. And again, we're going to look at some examples. I'll come back to this right at the end. But by that, I mean, rather than just did they get the vocabulary right and wrong, things like how engaged were they? What was their behavior like? What can we collect evidence of that's good in a way to keep them engaged, so that we're not recording a single assessment event, we're recording a range of different points. And as I say, I'll show you an example. So let's move on to my next point in the overview, which was what kind of assessment methods can we use? Well, as I say, you've all given lots of lovely examples. So really, I'm going to summarize and make some suggestions here. So the first thing that we can look at is what I call real-time online assessment. Now, this is when you've got your class or your students online and you are trying to assess them. You're trying to collect evidence while you're talking to them, while you're actually online. And I think there are different ways to do this. And as I say, I'll give you the overview and we'll move on to some examples. Now, the first thing I think, which is part of retrieval practice, is to use what I call deep questioning. So we don't, obviously when we're online, we don't want to have lots of silences, especially with young students, because they get bored and switch off and start doing something else. Goodness knows what they're doing. So one way to keep them engaged is to make sure that we ask lots of questions. And you can make notes while you're asking them the questions. So as you ask them about a language point, it might be some vocabulary. You might want to ask them not just the vocabulary, not just what's the answer here, not just what's the word, oh, you got that right or wrong, which is scoring, but you might want to ask them, well, when do we use that word, or where do we use it, or who do we use it with, or how do we use it, so that you're following each point up with more and more questioning. And what happens then is, even if they didn't know the word in the beginning, they then become to know the word because you've asked so many questions about it. So you're reinforcing their learning at the same time as assessing them and how well they can answer. You can understand, if they're cheating, how well they understand this word if you're concerned that that's what the issue is. We also, I think it's a very good idea with young learners and in the current situation to use repetition a lot to keep them engaged. So when perhaps you're trying to do a little sort of vocabulary memory assessment online, when you get a correct answer from a student, you elicit the correct answer, make sure others repeat it. So Luca answers, Maria, also what's the answer? Anna, also what's the answer? So that you get this constant repetition. So as I say, even if you feel that they actually don't really know this, maybe they've looked it up, they're getting a lot of repetition and you can be more sure they'll know it by the end. Another thing you can get students to do is reporting. So they might, you might ask them to report on something that you feel they know well. So again, we'll look at some examples of this, but you might have done a little reading text with them, and you might want them to repeat the main points back to you. Now that is collecting evidence, because if they can repeat the points back to you, then you can see how well you can make a judgment on how well they've understood it. Okay, so it's about making judgment. So, of course, the other thing, which I guess a lot of you will be doing, judging on what I've seen in the notes, is you'll be doing what we call offline assessment or preparation. So you might be giving them exercises or writing before class, and then you want them to come into class and report on it. And some of you have mentioned also projects. So again, I think these are very good ways that you can assess students. You can give them an exercise or a task to complete offline, or perhaps you want them to go away and work together on a project. And it doesn't matter if they look things up, if they're not, if it's not from their memory or whatever. What happens is that because they're doing this, they start to know it, and then you ask them to report in class, you ask them questions in class, and you are collecting evidence about how well they understand. So the assessment is not the worksheet they've done at home. The assessment is you exploring the answers to that when you're in class. And it makes them feel much more comfortable as well. They're not having to, they can share their answers together. And the last point, which is something, again, I'll come back to much more at the end, which is what I call this ongoing observational assessment, which is you as a teacher basically making notes on all the different aspects of what the student knows or does or is engaged with, so that over this sort of rather difficult time where you're not actually in touch with the students, it feels rather strange. You're building up your own observational picture of each student. You're pulling together a little report which you can look back on over the weeks or over time. Even when you come to the end of term, you've got a little set of notes on each student, which will help you when you're trying to, make that judgment. So let's now move on. I said some examples about what kind of activities we can use. And as I said, so let's start with, we want to assess language points. So by this, I mean vocabulary and grammar. And as I say, this is a particular concern where you think, well, I don't know whether they're cheating or not. But as I say, let's not worry about cheating. Let's worry about performance. So one thing you might do is do the exercises offline. As we said, the gap fill, the definitions, making sentences, whatever your worksheet or form is. They then have to report their answer in class. You would elicit this from them. But that's not, I would argue, where you're going to make the assessment. As I've said in the last slide, what is a good idea is when you've asked one student, ask 3 other students the same question, or keep coming back to it so that they're repeating and they're not switching off. They don't know who you're going to ask, so that they're engaged when they're online. And then your assessment comes where you're going to use some deep questioning to see how far they understand what you've been trying to tell them. So let's look at a quick example. Let's say that offline on paper, you've got a worksheet where they've got to complete the sentences in the past tense. So yesterday we blanked my grandparents, and the student went, and you ask them in class, and maybe you get some to repeat. Now your follow-ups might look like this, still using the past tense. Well, when did you go there? Who did you go with? How did you get there? Where do your grandparents live? Or you might want to put in another prompt, like asking them to say the same with cousins or friends. You might want them to create a grid after you've done some examples for them to ask questions of their peers. So that what you're doing there is you're making sure you're repeating the points. So if some of them have been switched off, or they have looked it up, or they haven't really engaged, they're getting it because they're repeating. But then also through this questioning, you're both repeating it and you're getting them to think about the actual context and the situation. So it really goes into their head and they remember, and you can make a fair judgment on how well they understand. Let's say you ask those questions and none of them understand. You know then that they don't understand the grammar point and you'd have to go back and repeat it. So let's look at another example of an activity with vocabulary. Now, this is a little exercise from the look book. I'm just thinking, one of you said, isn't repetition boring for young learners? I would say not. I don't mean mechanical drilling repetition, but where they don't know they're going to be called on. They don't know whose name you're going to call next, and they've got to repeat it and they get it right, because I think you will all appreciate that certainly in primary school, young learners, they love being right. Their favorite thing is to be right and to get praise. And so this is what you really want to foster in them, this sort of confidence and achievement. So having looked at that point quickly, let me just go back to this. So we've got a vocabulary example here. So obviously, perhaps at home, they go home and they've got a choice of, they've got to complete these sentences with the right words. So again, oops, hang on, I'm not clicking on the right thing. They complete the task offline. Then when they come back to class and you're checking it with them, first of all, let's take question 1. You elicit the answer, sports centre. You get several of them to repeat it, and then you start asking them questions. When do you go to the sports centre? Who do you go with? What can you do there? Maybe a higher level might be, why do you go to the sports centre? So that the whole time they're more engaged with the task because you're making it real life and you're making it about them, as with the grammar. But at the same time, you're assessing, not in a scoring way, but in an observational way. You're collecting evidence about how well they understand something. Okay, let's look at some skills testing here. And I mean, really, the principles are the same. Let me just ask you a quick poll here. When we look at the skills, reading, writing, listening, speaking, which do you think is the hardest to assess online? Could you all just go into the poll and vote there if you can? You don't need to write in the chat box, just go into the poll and tick what you think is the hardest to assess online, and we'll let several of you answer and then we'll see what the voting says. I'll just give you a few minutes to keep going with the votes. There's a clear winner here. Of what's the most difficult, which I'm actually surprised about. So we'll keep going. Okay, I want to move on a bit, so I'm going to stop you there. So let's stop the poll there, because consistently what's been throughout the time you've been voting, what's happened is over half of you have said that writing is the most difficult thing to assess online. So I'm going to look at an example of that shortly, but that's very interesting. That's very interesting to know that you find writing hard to assess online. I mean, I think speaking and writing are the tricky ones anyway because they're productive, but let's look at perhaps how we can address that. So I'm going to start just with an example of how you might assess reading or speaking. So again, we've got a little reading activity here from Look, where they look at the picture there, which has got various things going on, and they then read those sentences, which could be a little bit of text, and they have to say what's true and what's false. Okay, so again, if you want it, you don't want them silently reading when they're online, so they could go off and they could do that sort of activity at home. As I say, we're not going to worry about cheating. Now, when they come back in and you're checking through it, Yes, you can check the answers, but look what you can also do with it. You can ask them, as I say, some deep questions. What's the zebra drinking? What's the weather like? Which is the biggest animal? What's the baby elephant doing? Now, if they can or can't answer those questions, that gives you information, that gives you evidence about how far or how well they've been able to do that reading. So, for example, they might have guessed the answers to true, false, and you don't know because they've done it at home. But by asking them questions, you can get a sense of understanding how far they truly understand it. Now, something else you could do is you could ask them to cover the information or close their books. Obviously, you probably can't see if they're doing that, and ask them what can they remember about the story. Now, the important thing here is thinking about what are you assessing. If you say to the students, what can you've read this, what can you remember about this picture, this story? You're not assessing their grammar. What you're assessing is how far they've understood what they've been looking at. So it's a very important point. Don't try, and I think this might be one of the issues with writing, don't try to assess everything at once. Try and keep your focus on what you're collecting evidence on. This activity is about a skill. It's not about grammar. You're collecting evidence on their reading ability and their understanding. So when you're thinking, okay, they've done quite well or medium, stay focused on the reading. And don't worry if they're checking, themselves as you ask the question. The focus is on their oral production. So you can assess their reading here based on the accuracy in the information, and you would tell them this, as I said at the beginning, you might say, well, actually, they've done the reading, but I'm not going to assess their reading. I'm going to make this an integrated activity. I'm going to assess their speaking. So you might, as I say, you might ask them to say, what can you remember? Can you report the story? Can you report about this? And you might want to assess the speed or fluency or intelligibility of their speaking. So what I'm saying is when you're online like this, you've got this very sort of almost offline activity, but you can use it online in your online classroom to make it work for your assessment judgments. And as I say, you must remember to tell the students what you're doing to be fair to them. I'm going to be listening to your speaking, or I'm going to be seeing what you can remember. And then, of course, you want to record your results. And they might be, you don't want to score, did they get 4 questions right? But how well did they answer? Did they expand their answers? Did they just answer yes, no? To get a picture of each child and what they're like. Okay, so let's look at another example which does focus on writing. So here I'm going to look at a writing task to see how we can also use it for listening or speaking. Again, this is a little writing activity from the Look coursebook, and it's actually one which helps them start to practice for the young learners key, the Cambridge key test for young learners. And what they've got to do is look at the pictures and write a story, and they're given some prompt words there. It's 3 pictures. It's a pretty simple story. So again, you can ask them, now I would say you can do this 2 ways. You can say you've done most of the unit and you can say, well, they can do this now. You can ask them to go and write this story offline, and then they come back into the online classroom, and you want them to start each taking it in turns to read their story. So you might start with the first picture. You might get several of them to say, what did I do? What did I write for the first picture? You might have a vote on who had the nicest version. Or if you're building for success, what you might do is ask the students some questions about this so that they've got some thoughts, and then ask them to go and write, because normally we only write when we have information. We don't write when we don't have information. So let's look. You see, you might have an example here. You might look at these pictures with the class online and say, well, where were the children? What were they doing? What did they see? That's just some examples. You'd ask more questions than that. And when you'd gone through that with the students, then you might want them to go off and write the story for homework offline. So in this way, you're doing what I call you're building success, you're building achievement. So you're not having them come back to the class and they didn't know what to do or they've done it badly. What you want is some nice samples and some nice versions. Now, you might want to try and assess some listening skills here. So once they've done their writing and they've come back with their written version into the classroom, you might say to this one student, right, you tell me what you've written for the first picture, and the other students have to listen carefully and say, what can they add? What additional information can they add to that first student's version? Then repeat with student 3. So they're building a version, and not only that, they're building it collaboratively, and they're building a good version. So you know they've got a good example by the time you've completed the exercise. Once you've done this with all the 3 pictures, you can ask the students to go back and write a second version offline, which will be an improved version, and that will be the version that you will assess. And they will be motivated because they will know, they will feel confident they've got the tools they need to write a good version, and they will want your praise and your reward about their achievement. And at the same time, they're repeating, so they're embedding what they're doing. The next class, you might say, and I have to say, I think with young learners, repetition is everything, because they, stuffs out 1 minute. The next class, the students might take turns to read the new improved version. They now feel confident because they know they've got an improved version. You might ask the students to ask each other questions about the pictures. Where were the children? What they were doing? You might ask them to cover the story and have a game. What can they remember? But all the time, what you're doing is assessing. Now, some of you, well, a lot of you said you struggled to assess writing online. And I would say, well, let's think about this. What are we assessing here? It's a skill. We're assessing the skill of writing. So you want to decide what you're going to assess. Are you going to assess how full, how complete the story is? Are you going to assess their spelling? Are you going to assess their linking or their organization? So I would say don't assess everything. Choose something, tell the students what you're assessing, and the next time you do a story, choose something else to assess on writing. Okay. You can assess listening here. You can assess what they've spotted in each other's versions. And again, you're not doing scoring. You're making notes for your observational evidence. Okay, now time is marching on. So let's move on to looking at, so we've looked at some very quick examples there of activities we can use. As I say, we haven't got time to do lots, but I'm hoping you can take some of those and adapt them for your own purposes. But let's think now, I've been talking all the time about recording progress and this idea of getting a range of points. So let me just talk through some of that for you. Now, the first thing I said is make sure you record in your notes a range of assessment points or criteria for each student. Now, by this, I mean, don't just comment on their grammar or what they got right. You can comment on their engagement, on their enthusiasm, on their behavior, on the fact they completed a task even if they got it wrong. Make sure that you've got a range of assessment points so that you can reports, you've got some evidence for every student, because obviously the parents, the school's going to ask you, well, how are they doing? And you need, as we've said, you're collecting evidence. And think about when you record these points. Obviously, you're not doing this all the time. You've got enough on your plate, but choose, in the time that you have with the students, and I don't know if you're seeing them once a week or more than once a week, when are you going to record these? When are you just going to be teaching, and when are you going to record these assessment points? And as I've tried to show you in the activities, try and break down the skills into small assessment parts and build those parts over time. Don't try, for example, with writing, to do organisation, spelling, grammar, everything all at once. Just choose one part and build and build and build over time. And then what can you record? Well, one thing, that you might like to start encouraging in your young learners is self-assessment. So let me ask you now on a quick poll. You'll see there's a poll there which asks you, do you use self-assessment for the students? If you can just answer yes or no. Don't type into the chat box, just answer yes or no. Oh, and okay, that's a very quick answer there. I can see that almost 3/4 of you do use self-assessment with the students, so that's absolutely great. I think, this, so say the point about self-assessment, I'm sure you know, is make sure they've got specific points, that they know what they're assessing on, that they can keep repeating until they feel confident and happy. You can also, which I'm sure many of you use, is peer assessment. And as I say, many of you will know this already, but don't make this about grammar and vocabulary. Make it task-based. Okay, so if they're assessing each other, make it task-based. Did I like the way you've done that task? Could you have put more information in? How well have we done it? Okay, so it's another dimension for you in assessment. It's not the be all and end all, but it's another dimension. And also in, the online environment, we don't want to lose that collaborative opportunity they have in the classroom. Finally, when you're giving your teacher feedback, so you've done your assessment and you're going to give them you must give them some feedback on, oh, you did that very well, or, let's look at this again. You're going to give them some feedback. Always make sure that you give them, because they're young learners, a single improvement point. Don't say to them, oh, you need to do better grammar and you need to think more about your spelling. Just give them a single improvement point, and again, build it over time and give them an opportunity to repeat what they've done so that they build a model of success. That's very important. Now, in terms of recording progress, something I also want to show you is, because we've said let's, not focus on scoring, and I know that all of you are going to be terribly busy and don't want piles of extra preparation. So let's look at how we can use a learner management system. So we've got one here which is used in a lot of the course books that National Geographic produce, but with Look, you can record the progress, obviously, in the LMS over time. So, for example, on this page, you can see that you've got the names of your students, you've got the assignments they've completed, and their learning time. Now, You remember I said that you want to take a range of points. Now, one of the points you might want to note in your evidence is, did they complete all their assignments? You can use the LMS for that. Now, if they did, that's a good point. Maybe they got a lot of them wrong. That's not the issue. The evidence here is, yes, they've done well. They completed all the assignments, so you can report positively back on that. And then if you actually go into the individual students, you can see that we can also record here the time that they take to do something and the number of attempts. And again, you can report back on this. You don't want them to do things too quickly. You want them to take a reasonable amount of time. If they have, you can be positive about that. That's more evidence for you of how the student's engaging. So when I said to you right at the beginning, it's about gathering evidence. This is what I mean. It's not all about assessment and did they get the worksheet right. It's all the different ranges of evidence you've got that this student is making progress. So as I said, so here you might want to look at the time they've taken, or you might want to look at the number of attempts. You know, maybe they got it right, but they took 10 attempts, which isn't so great. Maybe they got some parts wrong, but they did it all in one attempt, in which case that's the feedback you can give them. You know, take a little bit longer, or, you know, check it and have a second shot at it. But these are all little dimensions that you can record as evidence of your assessment. So that's how we record progress. And then how do we report progress? Well, I've mentioned these points. This is really just a summary. So always make sure, because they're young learners, because they're in an uncomfortable situation at the moment especially, always make sure to report something positive on each student. Even if it's not about their language, make sure you can say something positive for each student. Remember to record, to collect your evidence over a period of time rather than a single event, so that you build a picture and so that you can see that progress over time, and that the child doesn't feel they're being judged on a single event in the same way, because we know that that's not reliable at the moment. You need to explain the evidence system you're using to the person you're reporting to. So obviously, I've said you let the students know what you're, collecting evidence on, but you also might want to explain to parents or to the school, and it actually protects you, so that rather than being subjective, you're saying, no, look, I've got this objective recording sheet, which is the same for every student, and I can show you how the students have performed. And remember also, you want to build in notes with specific steps of how to improve. Maybe not at every point that you assess, but at some points you're going to stop and you'd say, how do we improve? So just to summarize what we've what we've gone through today, what are the next steps? So first of all, I would say, let's change our mindset. Let's not think we're doing assessment. Let's remind ourselves we're collecting evidence. That's what we're doing. Try to use what I call deep questioning, which some of you familiar with Bloom's taxonomy might know, and repetition to sort of build your picture and your evidence. Create your observational record system. And my key point, because you're all teachers, you're all assessing all the time, is trust yourself. I'm sure you're doing the right thing by your students. So thank you very much for listening today, and I hope most of you have found that some of those points helpful.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I think this is a good time to wrap up. I'm just going to share a quick box with a few links in it that I thought might be useful. You can actually click the Browse To button and they will open up. The first link in there is to the online practice platform that just won the Cody Award recently from National Geographic Learning, and that's available for a few of the Young Learner series, including Look There, and that was some of the examples that Elaine showed earlier on recording assessment were from there, but those principles that she went through, as she mentioned, can be applied no matter what LMS you're using. So that's just one option available I thought I'd share with you. Second one is a link to the Look series. As I mentioned at the beginning, Elaine is a course consultant for Look, so definitely be sure to check that out if you're interested in learning more. It's a 7-level series from National Geographic Learning for young learners of English. And the third one is a link to the InFocus blog. If you haven't checked it out, I definitely recommend you do. We have a blog published there, a few actually, from Elaine from the past on assessment. So those would be great to check out, and we'll post another one on there soon from her. So great. So thanks everyone for joining. As we wrap up, just want to mention we will be sending along a certificate for joining us today. We'll be sending along the slides from the session so you can refer to those, as well as a recording link. And we'll also post those on our website as well. They'll get to you in just about 5 business days. So be patient. We'll get those to you as soon as possible. Great, and we hope we can see you again soon. Thanks so much for spending an hour of your day with us. We had a wonderful, really a lot of great interaction here and great participation, almost 1,000 people on here. So thank you everyone for your contributions and for spending an hour with us. As a reminder, we do have a second session of the same webinar later today. It's at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, so definitely tell any of your friends or colleagues if you think they'd like to join us that they should sign on for that session. Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to send you along to the feedback survey now. Let us know what we thought, and we hope we see you again soon. And happy teaching. Thank you again for being part of the community. All right. Bye now.